Hello and welcome to this economics revision for IB and A-level video. Today looking at protectionism and more specifically subsidies. So firstly, what is a subsidy? Well, it's actually a protectionist policy, and protectionism is the implementation of barriers to trade such as tariffs, quotas and subsidies, as we've seen in previous slideshows. A subsidy is a payment by the government to businesses in order to incentivise domestic production. So what it typically does is the government will pay a per unit amount to businesses to encourage production, and this effectively shifts their supply to the right because it decreases their cost of production. So there's lots of real life examples of this. There's been a really famous example recently of a disagreement between the US and the EU regards to Boeing and Airbus both being subsidised. But the example we're going to have a look at today is China has been subsidising its steel industry for more than a decade. Stakeholder effects then. So what happens when a subsidy is paid? Well, consumers are not going to be affected. They're still going to pay the same price and they're going to demand the same quantity. So actually, consumers, you can say, are not affected by this. Whereas domestic producers, they're clearly going to be better off. They're going to receive a higher price due to the government payment on top of the world price. And so they're better off. They're going to increase their production from Q1 to Q2. Overseas producers, well, they're going to be worse off because the imports are going to shrink into our country that we're looking at from Q3 Q1 to Q3 Q2, and clearly if domestic production is increasing, the overseas producers are going to lose out on sales. The government, well, the government is going to cost them a lot of money, isn't it? And so an opportunity cost is going to arise for the government funds. The money is going to be going to subsidising private industry and providing jobs effectively, but it could have been spent on the NHS, it could have been spent on education, it could have been spent on roads and infrastructure. And so there is an opportunity cost that arises. The taxpayer is in effect paying to subsidise industry. Global trade relations could suffer. It could be another stakeholder effect, because if one country sees that another one is subsidising its industries and then dumping within that country, they're going to fall out, aren't they? There's going to be a bit of a trade war. We've seen that in the past with Donald Trump getting very grumpy about China subsidising their steel industry and dumping, which is then selling on cheaper made steel into the US, and he put in place tariffs to the tune of 25% to try and stop that. Looking now at the graph, so this is what the subsidy diagram looks like. So what's happened here? Well, we started with Q3 minus Q1 of imports in the country at the world price level. You can see our domestic equilibrium is much higher than the world price level, so we're not very efficient within this country. But what the government has decided to do, they want to incentivise production to 0 to Q2. This shifts our supply curve to the right. So you can see there that actually we end up at D for our equilibrium, and so you can see that the imports shrink from Q3 Q1 down to Q3 Q2. So it's a significant impact that the subsidy is having. What does it cost the government? Well, they're paying on the production of 0 to Q2, they're paying a per unit price. And what did our domestic suppliers need to be paid to produce Q2? We have to move upwards from D to our original supply curve to see where they would move along their supply curve to, and the answer is F. And so therefore the total cost of the government is B, D, F, G. They're paying the amount up from B to G on the on the domestic production of B, D. Okay, so that is the total cost of the government, that rectangle B, D, F, G. Okay. As you can see, the overseas producers lose out. Their revenue falls from Q3 Q1 CE to Q3 Q2 DE. But the domestic producers are getting much more. They were getting 0BC Q1, and they now get 0GF Q2, a significant improvement for them. Consumers, as you can see, still pay world price because it's the government that is paying the amount B to G on the price. So let's have a little look at another example of this. So application and context for this one. Have a look at Bangladesh subsidies crippling the jute industry, say the Indian Jute Mills Association. So what's been happening here? Well, Bangladesh and India both produce a material called jute, which you'll find in baggage typically. And so you often see jute bags as the reusable shopping bags in shops. The government of India is considering whether to continue anti-dumping duties against exports from Bangladesh in jute products. The issues are arising at a time when the jute industry is really under crisis of shortage of raw materials, so there's actually a lack of jute in the world, and the Indian Jute Manufacturers Association have called for a revision of the price cap of 6,500 rupees per quintal of raw jute. Over the past few months, more than a dozen of mills have been closed down in West Bengal, leaving 60,000 workers out of work. So there's a serious issue going on here with Bangladesh and India trying to compete, and that the subsidies that Bangladesh are providing to their mills is really hurting the Indian competition because they're able to produce at a lower cost of production. Okay, so you can see that that's having a negative impact on employment within India in the Indian jute mills because they just can't compete at that price level. Okay, so it's a really good example there of a subsidy. Hopefully that clears up subsidies for you. I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video, which we're moving on to exchange rates.